That night changed everything. I didn't know it then, but nothing would ever be the same again. It was late, so late the world outside seemed like it had fallen asleep. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft creaks of the wooden floorboards were the only sounds that kept me company. I sat on the couch, the dim light from a lone lamp painting my shadow on the wall. My mind buzzed with thoughts I didn't want to admit, not even to myself. Across the room, Kellen sat hunched over his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. The soft glow of the screen lit up his features, the sharp angle of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the faint freckles scattered across his nose like constellations. I looked away quickly, heart hammering as though he could somehow feel my gaze. We had always been close, closer than most siblings. Losing our parents when we were young had forced us to grow up together, leaning on one another to navigate a world that didn't stop to offer any favors. But recently, something had shifted. I told myself it was just the stress of living together, two adults trying to coexist in a small space. Maybe it was the way his laugh lingered in my head longer than it should, or the way his casual touches sent a warmth rushing through me that I couldn't explain. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake it, and tonight, it felt heavier than ever.
Hey, you okay?
Kellen's voice broke through my thoughts, soft but tinged with concern. I startled, fumbling for a response. Yeah, just tired, I guess. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like he could see right through me. Then he smiled, a small crooked thing that always managed to put me at ease. You've been pushing yourself too hard. You should get some sleep. I nodded, though I didn't move. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, watching as he returned to his work, his fingers flying over the keyboard. There was something so effortlessly graceful about him, something I'd never noticed until recently, or perhaps I had, and I just hadn't let myself dwell on it. The clock ticked away, and the tension in the room grew almost tangible. My thoughts swirled, a chaotic mess of emotions I didn't know how to name. Part of me wanted to say something, to reach out and break the silence that stretched between us. But another part, one I wasn't ready to confront, kept me frozen in place, afraid of what might happen if I did. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the calm before the storm, the last breath of normalcy before everything changed. Kellen and I had always been close. Growing up without much, we learned early on that family was what you made of it. When our parents passed away in an accident, I was only 10, and Kellen, 4 years older, had to step into a role he was far too young for. He became my anchor, my guide, my everything. I remember the nights we spent huddled together under blankets when the power went out in the old house we inherited. Kellen would make up stories to keep my mind off the dark, his voice steady and warm, even when I knew he was just as scared as I was. Those moments shaped our bond, one built on trust, resilience, and the shared understanding that we only had each other. As we got older, that bond didn't waver. If anything, it grew stronger. Kellen was the first person I turned to when I failed a test, broke up with my first boyfriend, or needed advice on navigating life. He wasn't just my brother, he was my best friend, my confidant, the one person I felt completely safe with. But living together as adults had its challenges. After Kellen lost his job due to company layoffs, we decided to share an apartment to save money. It was practical, convenient, and if I was honest, comforting. I liked having him around, even if it meant dealing with his bad habits, like leaving the dishes in the sink or hogging the bathroom mirror in the morning. Our days settled into a comfortable routine. Kellen liked to cook, so most evenings, he'd be in the kitchen, experimenting with recipes while I lounged on the couch, pretending to help. His enthusiasm for food was infectious, and more often than not, I'd find myself joining him, chopping vegetables or taste-testing sauces while we joked about the mess we were making. On weekends, we'd marathon old movies or play board games, the kind of stuff we used to do as kids. It felt nostalgic, like a small pocket of the past we could hold on to. Kellen had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel special, whether it was a late-night snack run or an impromptu dance party in the living room. But there were also the moments that weren't so easy to define. Like the way his hand would linger on my shoulder when he passed by, or how his laughter would echo in my chest long after the joke had passed. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way his hair curled at the nape of his neck when he was sweaty from a run, or the quiet intensity in his eyes when he was focused on something. At first, I brushed it off as admiration, the kind you feel for someone who's always been there for you. But then there were the nights when I couldn't sleep, and I'd find myself staring at his closed door, a knot of emotions twisting in my chest. I told myself it was just the stress of our situation, the proximity, the nostalgia of being together again. But the little things started to add up. The way his presence felt like a gravitational pull, drawing me in no matter how much I tried to resist. The way my heart skipped a beat when he smiled at me in that way only he could, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I tried to ignore it, to bury the feelings deep where they couldn't surface. After all, he was my brother. That line was clear, immovable, a boundary that couldn't, and shouldn't, be crossed. But the more I tried to suppress it, the more it seemed to grow, like a quiet storm building in the distance. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, our legs brushing against each other, I felt it again, that spark, that undeniable tension that seemed to hang in the air between us. Kellen didn't seem to notice, his eyes fixed on the screen, but I couldn't focus on anything except the warmth of his leg against mine and the way my pulse quickened at the contact. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, turning to look at me. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't push, but his gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to the movie. I let out a shaky breath, my heart racing. These moments were becoming more frequent, subtle, fleeting, but impossible to ignore. It was like a current running beneath the surface of our interactions, pulling me in despite every effort to stay grounded. I told myself it was just a phase, a product of our circumstances. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, a part of me didn't want it to stop. It started with the small things. At first, they felt inconsequential, a brief glance, an accidental touch, the way our conversations began to linger on topics neither of us seemed willing to move past. But over time, these moments began to feel different, like puzzle pieces forming a picture I was afraid to see clearly. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find Kellen in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something that smelled incredible. He glanced over his shoulder as I walked in, his face lighting up in that effortless way that always seemed to take me off guard. "Perfect timing," he said, motioning toward the table. "I made your favorite." I couldn't help but smile as I dropped my bag and sat down. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he replied simply, setting a steaming bowl in front of me. It was such a small gesture, but it meant the world in a way I couldn't quite explain. As I ate, I found myself watching him, the way he moved around the kitchen with a quiet confidence, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the faint scars on his forearms, memories of a childhood spent climbing trees and taking risks. We talked about our days, laughing over silly anecdotes and commiserating over shared frustrations. But there was something beneath the surface, an unspoken tension that seemed to weave through our words. I felt it in the way his eyes lingered on mine a fraction too long, in the pauses that stretched between sentences, in the way my heart raced every time he smiled at me. Later that night, as we sat on the couch, the glow of the television casting shadows across the room, the atmosphere felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Kellen leaned back, his arm resting on the back of the couch, his fingers just inches from my shoulder. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his voice soft. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." It was a lie, of course. The truth was, I wasn't fine. I was far from fine. His hand moved, brushing lightly against my shoulder, and I felt my breath catch. It was such a simple gesture, so casual, but it sent a rush of warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. "You've been working too hard," he said, his tone tinged with concern. "You need to take better care of yourself." "I'm trying," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence stretching between us, heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of it making my skin tingle. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, our eyes met. It was a fleeting moment, just a heartbeat, but it felt like everything shifted in that instant. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker, and I couldn't look away. His expression was unreadable, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart pound, a vulnerability, a question, a spark of something I didn't dare name. "Kellen," I began, my voice faltering. He leaned closer, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. The distance between us seemed to shrink, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. But just as quickly he pulled back, his expression shifting to something guarded, almost apologetic. "Sorry," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't mean to. I should go to bed." He stood abruptly, leaving me sitting there, stunned and confused. The warmth of his touch lingered on my skin, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't untangle. That moment marked the beginning of a shift I couldn't ignore. The dynamic between us was changing, and no matter how much I tried to push it away, it kept creeping into every interaction, every glance, every touch. The next few days were a blur of avoidance and tension. Kellen seemed quieter, more reserved, as if he was trying to put distance between us. But the more he pulled away, the more I felt the pull toward him, like gravity drawing me closer despite every effort to resist. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading, Kellen walked in. He paused in the doorway, his expression uncertain, as if he was debating whether or not to say something. "Can we talk?" he asked finally, his voice low. I nodded, my heart pounding as he sat down across from me. "I don't know what's going on between us," he began, his gaze fixed on the table. "But I feel like something's changed. And I don't know if it's just me, but I can't keep pretending like I don't feel it." My breath caught, his words hitting me like a wave. I wanted to say something to reassure him, to tell him he wasn't alone in this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Kellen looked up, his eyes searching mine, and in that moment, it felt like the world fell away. There was no judgment, no fear, just the raw, unfiltered truth of what we were both feeling. "I don't know what this means," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I don't want to ignore it anymore." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Me neither." The shift was undeniable now, the dynamic between us forever changed. And while the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: we couldn't go back to the way things were. The only question was where we would go from here. It happened on a rainy evening, the kind of night that made the world feel smaller, quieter. The sound of raindrops against the windows filled the apartment, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the tension building between us. Kellen and I had been dancing around each other for days, both aware of the shift but too afraid to name it. Every conversation felt loaded, every glance a question we were too scared to ask. Tonight was no different, or so I thought. We were sitting in the living room, the television playing some forgettable show we weren't really watching. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, the warmth of his body just inches away, and it was all I could do to keep my breathing steady. Kellen reached for the remote to lower the volume, his hand brushing mine in the process. It was such a small thing, but it sent a jolt through me, my heart skipping a beat as I pulled my hand away. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice tight. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. The tension between us had become unbearable, a constant undercurrent that made every moment feel charged, electric. Kellen leaned back against the couch, letting out a long sigh. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice breaking the silence like a clap of thunder. My heart sank, fear and anticipation warring within me. "Doing what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "Pretending like nothing's changed when it's obvious that it has." I looked down at my hands, my chest tightening. "I don't know what you mean," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't do that," he said, his tone sharper now. "Don't act like you don't feel it too." I glanced up at him, the vulnerability in his eyes breaking something inside me. He wasn't angry, he was scared, just like I was. "Kellen," I started, my voice faltering. "This isn't. We can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, leaning forward, his expression intense. "Why can't we? Who says we have to pretend like this isn't happening?" "Because it's wrong," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Because you're my brother and this, whatever this is, it can't happen." He flinched at my words, the pain flashing across his face like a lightning strike. For a moment, I hated myself for saying them, for hurting him when he had done nothing but be honest with me. "Do you really believe that?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling. "That it's wrong to feel this way?" "Because I've tried so hard to ignore it, to push it away, but I can't. I can't stop thinking about you, about us, and it's tearing me apart." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, his words cutting through every defense I had built. "Do you think this is easy for me?" I said, my voice rising. "Do you think I haven't been fighting this too? I'm terrified, Kellen. I don't know what to do, and I don't want to lose you." "You're not going to lose me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere. But we need to stop pretending. We need to talk about this, even if it's messy, even if it's hard." The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with everything we had left unsaid. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I tried to find the right words. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to be around you without feeling like I'm drowning." Kellen reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. The touch was grounding, a lifeline in the storm raging inside me. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together. But only if we're honest with each other." I met his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes breaking through the walls I had spent so long building. For the first time, I let myself be vulnerable, let myself feel everything I had been trying to suppress. "I'm scared," I confessed, the tears spilling over now. "I'm scared of what this means, of what people will think, of losing you if we can't figure this out." "You're not going to lose me," he repeated, his voice firm. "No matter what, we'll figure it out. But I need you to be honest with me. Do you feel it too? Or am I just imagining all of this?" I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. But I couldn't lie to him, not now, not after everything. "I feel it," I said finally, the words barely more than a whisper. "I feel it every time you look at me, every time you touch me. And it scares me, Kellen. It scares me because I don't know how to stop." He let out a shaky breath, a mixture of relief and emotion crossing his face. "You don't have to stop," he said, his hand tightening around mine. "We'll take this one step at a time, figure out what it means, and what we want. But we don't have to do it alone." For a moment, we just sat there, the rain still falling outside, the tension slowly giving way to something softer, something fragile but hopeful. Kellen reached up, brushing a tear from my cheek, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. "You're not alone," he said again, his voice steady and sure. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed him. The rain had stopped by the time we moved from the living room to the small balcony outside our apartment. The air was fresh, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and a promise of something new. Kellen handed me a mug of tea, his fingers brushing mine briefly, a touch that still made my heart flutter despite everything we had just shared. We sat side by side, the city lights stretching out before us in a mosaic of warm yellows and cool whites. The silence between us felt different now, less like a barrier and more like a quiet understanding, a shared space where words weren't always necessary. For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. But the questions lingered, threading through my thoughts like ribbons of doubt. "What happens now?" I asked, breaking the silence. My voice was steady, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it, a quiet plea for reassurance. Kellen turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "We take it one day at a time," he said simply. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just figure it out as we go." His words were comforting, but they didn't erase the fears that gnawed at the edges of my mind. "What if we can't?" I asked, my gaze fixed on the distant skyline. "What if it's too complicated, too messy?" Kellen reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. "Life is messy," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. We'll face it together, whatever it is. You're not in this alone." I turned to him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, of doubt. But all I saw was quiet determination, a steady resolve that made my chest tighten. "You really mean that, don't you?" I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips despite myself. "I do," he replied, his tone unwavering. "No matter what, I'm here. For you. For us." The simplicity of his words struck me, their sincerity cutting through the fog of uncertainty that had clouded my thoughts for so long. I nodded, a small but significant gesture of acceptance, of trust. We sat there for a while longer, the cool night air brushing against our skin, the world around us quiet and still. It felt like the calm after a storm, a moment of peace that we both desperately needed. We sat there for a while longer, the cool night air brushing against our skin, the world around us quiet and still. It felt like the calm after a storm, a moment of peace that we both desperately needed. I think I'm scared because this feels so big, I admitted after a while. Like it's something that could change everything. It is big, Kellen said, his voice gentle. But that doesn't mean it's bad. Sometimes, the things that scare us the most are the ones that matter the most. His words stayed with me, resonating in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe he was right. Maybe the fear wasn't a sign to run away, but a sign to lean in, to take the leap despite the uncertainty. As the night wore on, we talked about the little things, the funny quirks we'd noticed about each other, the memories that had shaped who we were, the dreams we'd never shared with anyone else. It felt like rediscovering each other, peeling back the layers to find the truths we'd kept hidden for so long. There were still so many questions, so many challenges ahead. I didn't know how we would navigate the complexities of what we were feeling, how we would reconcile it with the world around us. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, Kellen turned to me, a small smile playing on his lips. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought about it for a moment, about everything that had led us here, about the fear and the confusion and the vulnerability we had shared. And then I shook my head, a quiet but firm answer. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I don't regret it. Not any of it." His smile widened, a hint of relief in his expression. "Me neither." We stayed on the balcony as the city began to wake, the sounds of life slowly filling the air. There was no grand resolution, no definitive answers to the questions that lingered. But there was a sense of peace, of possibility, that hadn't been there before. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the city, I realized that our story wasn't over, it was just beginning. And while the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: we would face it together, step by step, day by day. And for now, that was enough.